Hello and welcome to another episode on contemporary Western philosophy. After having seen the philosophy of the world and philosophy of man according to Sartre, today it's time to take a look at his philosophy of God. Now, as we all know, Jean-Paul Sartre, a well-known existentialist philosopher, had a unique perspective on God and human existence. He believed that humans have an impossible desire, the desire to be God. But since God, as traditionally conceived, is a contradiction in his philosophy, Sartre ultimately rejected the idea of God's existence. So let's take a look at this in little bit more detail. First and foremost, we see that every human being, according to Sartre, has a deep fundamental desire to be God or to be like God. So this is one of the fundamental desire that each and every one as a human being has. Now, what does he mean by this? In Sartre's philosophy, we have already seen that humans are torn between two modes of being. Now, we as humans want one stability and completeness, that is of the ensoi, and at the same time we also want freedom and self-awareness of the porsoi. Now, this desire itself is a contradiction. Why? Because it is impossible to have these two together. It is impossible to have stability and impossible to have freedom at the same time. Yet humans still desire to be something complete, whole and unchanging, while at the same time also remaining free. Now, this is what Sartre calls the desire to be God. Let's take, for example, someone who wants total control over their destiny. They never make mistakes, always being admired and never feeling uncertain. They want to be perfect, powerful and independent. In other words, they want to be like God. But we see that life is unpredictable. Humans make mistakes and no one can be completely independent. Now, this desire for absolute control is an example of what Sartre will call as the desire to be God. If you take a look at another example, let's take an artist who strives for a perfect piece of work, one that will never need improvement, one that will never age, one that will remain flawless forever. But we see that this is impossible because art, as we know, like human life, is always open to change and interpretation. And therefore, the artist desires an unreachable perfection, which Sartre will call as the desire to be God. Now, according to Sartre, this is what he will call as a useless passion. Now, why does he say so? Now, Sartre calls this desire as a useless passion because it can never be fulfilled. No human can be completely free and they cannot be completely stable at the same time. Humans keep chasing this impossible goal and this ultimately leads to frustration, anxiety and existential despair. Now, another important question we can ask is, was Sartre an atheist or was he an anti-theist? Now, we see that Sartre was an atheist, but his views on God was different from some other atheists. In the sense, he did not waste time debating whether God exists or does not exist. Instead, he argued that even if God did exist, it wouldn't change anything. This is because Sartre believed that people often use belief in God as an excuse to avoid responsibility. He saw religion as a kind of a bad faith, which is a way to escape the burden of freedom. So, what is exactly this bad faith? So, bad faith, according to Sartre, is when people deceive themselves and they try to avoid facing their true freedom and responsibility. Sartre believed that belief in God could sometimes function as a bad faith, that is, a way for people to avoid making their own choices and taking responsibility for their actions. Let's take, for example, a person who never takes action to improve their life and instead says it's all part of God's plan. Now, Sartre would say that this person is using religion as an excuse to avoid taking responsibilities in life. Or let's take, for example, a person who only does good deeds because they want to go to heaven or avoid hell. Now, this kind of person is not truly free in Sartre's view. Why? Because they are acting out of a fear or expectation, not out of true freedom. And therefore, Sartre believed that humans should make moral choices because they decide to and not because of some religious rewards or punishment. Now, Sartre says that man must save himself. And Sartre's existentialism teaches us that humans must create their own meaning. Now, in his book, Existentialism and Humanism, he says that even if God existed, that would make no difference. Why? Because man must rediscover himself and he must convince himself that he must save himself. This means that whether God exists or not, humans must take responsibility for their actions and choices. There is no external force that will give meaning to life. For example, a doctor, teacher, or an artist does not need God to tell them their life is meaningful. They can choose to dedicate themselves to their work, helping others, or creating art. Their purpose comes from their own choices and not from any external source. And therefore, ultimately, Sartre would say that we as humans must take full responsibility for our actions and choices. Nobody else, no external force can give meaning to our lives. And ultimately, when we'll take a look at Sartre's philosophy of God, we can say that humans desire to be God, to be both free and unchanging. Now, this is something that is impossible. And therefore, this desire creates a useless passion where people chase something they can never achieve. Sartre is an atheist, but his main argument is that even if God existed, humans would still have to create their own meaning and take responsibility for their lives. Therefore, many people use belief in God as an escape from freedom, avoiding responsibility for their choices. And Sartre will call this as bad faith. Now, what can we learn from Sartre? First and foremost, we must accept our freedom and take responsibility for our lives. We should not look for external meaning, but create our own. Life's meaning is not given. It is something we must build for ourselves. Now, when one studies the philosophy of Sartre, one may feel that Sartre's philosophy may seem harsh or difficult, but it challenges us to live authentically by taking full control of our actions without relying on external forces for meaning. So, that's it for this episode. We shall meet next time with another existentialist philosopher.